Alrighty, welcome to the 145th edition of the MMA Circus here on BloodyElbow.com and live on YouTube. My name is Nick Baldwin, and joining me for the first time as our guest co-host this week, he's been on once before, I believe, this past summer, but that was just as a guest. Now you're a guest co-host. It's Mookie Alexander, associate editor over at BloodyElbow.com. My colleague Mookie, how's it going?
It's going all right, Nick. Thanks for having me on. I know this was a short notice thing for me to co-host, and certain days I haven't been able to do it. I haven't had the time, but today is one of those days. It's your lucky day. Can't say the same for your viewers. You got to listen to me for the next hour, but nevertheless, including Jed Mishu. Yes, roll Tide, Jed.
Well, he's had many guest co-host spots on the show, so I figure I might as well pass one your way.
Yeah, too many guest co-host spots.
No kidding. Well, thank you again for stepping up on short notice. You're like Donald Cerrone, throwing it out there. You're the journalist Donald Cerrone, stepping up on short notice. Do appreciate that. Okay, so we don't have tons to talk about. We were just talking briefly off air, saying it's been a pretty slow news week over at Bloody Elbow, over at any other MMA website. Not a lot is going on this weekend. That doesn't really change. We have UFC Fight Night St. Louis. We have Jeremy Stephens, Choi. Fun fight at featherweight, but in general, not a huge card. Vitor Belfort, Uriah Hall, take that for what it's worth. I'm excited for Kamaru Usman. I'll give him that. He's taking on Emil Mech. We'll talk about that card a little bit later on, but I want to start out talking a little John McCarthy. Big John McCarthy, of course, just announced today by Bellator. He is now the newest addition to the Bellator broadcast booth. He is a color commentator as of next weekend, January 20th in Los Angeles, California. He will be making his color commentary debut alongside either Mike Goldberg or Mauro Ranallo. I don't know. Did they announce that? I don't think they announced who a partner will be yet. Did they?
Mauro is probably, there's a Showtime boxing event the same time as Bellator, so Mauro normally does that. So I'm thinking it's going to be Goldberg on the Bellator.
So that is happening. What do you make of this? Personally, it's going to be interesting. It's sort of, to me, it's like a wait and see. But I know McCarthy hasn't done a ton of commentary, but from sort of our recollections in general, he wasn't necessarily fantastic at it.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I think it was one of those affliction shows.
And we weren't born yet. It was 2007.
We weren't even born when that happened. So I got mixed feelings about it. It is certainly a surprise that Big John McCarthy is going to be, I guess, kind of sort of stepping away from MMA refereeing for the time being, and that he'll end up doing commentaries, replacing Jimmy Smith. The negative side is, historically, it doesn't matter which sport, referees tend not to be actual color commentators. Now, on the plus side, he is a jiu-jitsu black belt. He obviously knows the sport. What I'm hoping is that, of course, with all the confusion over judging, he is a licensed judge as well, that maybe what we'll hear often on these Bellator broadcasts is basically how the fight plays out from a judge's perspective and how important certain aspects of the fight are as it pertains to scoring. So maybe that's the sort of insight that he can provide. But McCarthy has a lot of interesting things to say, but he's not necessarily, to me, the top choice to be a color commentator. But I guess Bellator and Scott Coker believe that Big John is a big name in the sport. He's been around for decades, and I guess it's a big get for them.
It is weird, though. Like, when I saw the press release this afternoon, I was, I don't remember where I was, but I just checked my phone, get the email, and it's like, my first reaction was sort of confusion, almost. Like, I didn't quite understand it. Like, yeah, he's a big name. Yeah, he'll be an addition in the booth because he's a big name, because a lot of people, MMA fans, know who John McCarthy is. There's actually one of my dad's friends who they hadn't seen each other for like 7 years or whatever, was actually over the other night, and he's an MMA fan, and he actually mentioned how he hates McCarthy as a referee. So he's probably happy about this, but it was a little confusing, like, because, as you said, I saw some people making some comparisons to Dominic Cruz, and it's kind of accurate. Like, Dominic Cruz, his sort of problem is he just throws out facts, but he doesn't always fit the role of a commentator, in the sense that he's not the most exciting guy. That's why Daniel Cormier has, in my opinion, thrived in the color commentary booth in the year of 2017, because of, some people didn't like the Thug Rose thing at UFC 217, but his excitement makes it very raw, but it's good. And I'm not sure if John McCarthy can provide that.
Yeah, because you're so used to hearing him in a more professional role, officiating the fights. The odds of him trying to be like Daniel Cormier, like I understand that the what happened with the Namajunas Joanna fight, that was to me not one of Cormier's better moments, but you can tell he is new at this, and he clearly enjoys what he does. With Big John, obviously this is a new chapter in his life, and it's something that he wants to do. It's but something that you want to do and being good at it are two different things. So I think it's just going to be him and Goldberg for next week. I don't know if they're going to do three-man booth because Chael Sonnen is supposedly going to be doing some of these Bellator commentary gigs. And Chael, he obviously provides the sort of enthusiasm and promotional side of things, but even he has his shortcomings. As you would expect him to be, typical Chael Sonnen fashion. I really thought that this was like a one-off thing because Big John is based out of California most of the time, and this card is in California. But when I read that, okay, this is a long-term deal, uh, that's definitely surprising. Again, when you see referees in other sports, they're normally there for a very specific reason, like rules analysts in the NFL or in the NBA. I don't know about Major League Baseball or hockey, but definitely football and basketball. You often see former officials and commissioners of officiating putting in their 2 cents on the rules of the sport. McCarthy is doing fully fledged analysis, and it'll be interesting to see if that works out. Bellator didn't have the greatest of 2017, so maybe they figure a shakeup in the broadcast booth as a start.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, maybe we're not giving him enough credit. I mean, he started reffing in the UFC 2. I legitimately wasn't born then. That was 1994, I believe. And so maybe he will be magically good. But just from having listened to a few episodes of his podcast a couple of years back with Sean Wheelock, who happens to be a former Bellator commentator as well, he's not, let's be honest, he's not the most exciting guy. He's not going to be the Daniel Cormier in Bellator, but we'll see. Maybe he will be. Maybe he'll completely prove us all wrong. Although I got to say, the biggest plus to all of this is that we're going to get at the beginning of a fight, let's get it on, and then at the end, it is all over. You cannot complain about that.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. They've got the perfect concoction of McCarthy saying, "Let's get it on." Well, I don't think is he even going to say
I
that during the
think
start of the
so. I
broadcast?
read something in the release where I think he might be. Maybe not. Probably not, but maybe. I hope so.
Yeah, because that would be weird because people would think, wow, he's reffing and commentating at the same time. This is weird. I've just tuned in. But yeah, that would be something that two people that see McCarthy is obviously refereed in promotions all around the world and he does boxing as well. But Big John and Mike Goldberg are kind of synonymous with the UFC. And to see them on the Bellator side of things is definitely a quite different experience, especially with Goldberg. I still can't get used to Goldberg in the Bellator commentary booth.
No, I mean, we did a prediction podcast on Saturday, happened to be with Jed Meshew, of course. And one of our predictions we made was, will Mike Goldberg call the Bellator Cage Octagon sometime in 2018? And we both agreed that he would. So, yeah, I mean, it's sort of the whole trend of Bellator or UFC people going to Bellator, not just executives and judges and referees and commentators, but also the fighters, of course.
Yeah, this is. It seems like with the Coker era Bellator, they really want to emphasize just getting people, whether it's signing fighters or hiring people for the broadcasting, just getting people from the UFC or who've done UFC events that are familiar to the casual fan, and they figure that's what's going to draw in the ratings. Now, I don't think it can work uniformly because we see certain fighters like Musasi's Bellator debut did not do very good ratings, whereas I think Roy McDonald's did a little bit better. And then, of course, the late Kimball Slice, he was a massive ratings draw. And Kimball wasn't with the UFC for a very long time, but people remember him from that. So now that we're going to referees, it's a referees as an analyst. I'm Bellator does a lot of things that I don't care for too much. This is going to be a fascinating experiment to see them kind of think outside the box a little bit. Because if McCarthy ends up being drab and not particularly interesting or insightful, then he becomes an instant downgrade from Jimmy Smith. And to me, Jimmy Smith is one of the best in the business. But McCarthy, has to at least be competent. And if he's not competent, then it's another negative for Bellator.
It is odd though, because at the end of the day, this is basically because it seems it's not official. I don't think anyone has reported it, but it seems likely that Jimmy Smith will get signed to the UFC eventually, probably sooner than later. But it's kind of odd that this is going to end up being basically not a trade, I guess, but they're giving the UFC Jimmy Smith, and then they're taking in John McCarthy. As you said, it seems like a step down, but again, as we both said, I mean, McCarthy might just prove us wrong. But as you said, I think it'll be interesting to see scoring, because I know Bellator for a long time on their broadcast had Jimmy Smith, score the fights in between rounds, and that's something he didn't actually enjoy doing, and that's fair. Long we've talked about commentators aren't judges and they shouldn't be put in those shoes. That's something Smith talked about on Joe Rogan's show just a few days ago when Rogan had him on to talk about leaving Bellator. He said straight up, no, I didn't want to score the fights as a commentator. So it'll be interesting if they try to get McCarthy to, put him in those shoes, and if McCarthy would be willing to sort of fit both roles.
Yeah, it's in boxing. If you watch HBO, they've got Jim Lampley and then a couple of analysts, normally Max Kellerman and Roy Jones Jr. or Andre Ward or somebody like that. But then when they do the actual unofficial scorecard, they go to Harold Letterman, who's a former judge himself. Or if you're on Showtime, it's Morrow and then I guess Malinaji and then one other analyst, Al Bernstein. And when they ask for scorecards, they go to Steve Farhood, who I think is not just I think he's a current judge, I believe, either him or Steve Weisfeld. But the point is, they have a separate judge. UFC used to have a separate judge way back in the day. They would have Eddie Bravo scoring fights while Goldberg and Rogan did the commentary. I can understand Jimmy Smith's not wanting to do the scoring and the commentary at the same time, because it's hard to multitask that way. I mean, when we do play-by-play on Bloody Elbow, it's hard to try and describe all the action and then score it and try and do all those things all at once. So with Big John, he might have to do just that. Now, the one thing that I do like from Big John that he does regularly on Twitter is he answers questions about judging and what matters at takedown. Does takedown steal a round, or is this enough offense to win a round? So maybe what we'll see from the Bellator production team is to gear his commentary towards that sort of aspect of a fight, which is what are the judges seeing, or how do you see this from a judge's perspective? And maybe some pointers about referees, because we see how often referees get criticized, McCarthy himself, but other referees like Yamasaki or Herb Dean or Eve Levine, about not enforcing the rules properly. You can just imagine Goldberg or Morrow asking, all right, you're in this situation, would you deduct a point for groin strike, or would you call for disqualification, such and such? So there are ways to make this work. It's just I'm not confident that it will. I hope it does.
I think one area where McCarthy might shine is the whole, when there's sort of a weird situation, maybe a foul, maybe there's a foul, very occasionally when let's take the Geiger and Musashi Chris Weidman thing from last April, where Joe Rogan starts to sort of figure out what's going on. No one really knows what's going on. I think McCarthy can really do well in that spot and explaining to the casual audience and even a hardcore audience who might not be entirely familiar with every rule on the unified rules of MMA list. I think he might be able to do that really well, where we see Joe Rogan sort of try to do it sometimes, but he doesn't have this rule, completely right, or he is explaining it wrong. I think that's where that's one spot where John McCarthy can do well, because he helped create the rules.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Joe Rogan. Mark Ratner is supposed to know these rules, and quite often he just stumbles over himself. and it's cringeworthy to watch, because like that Alex Oliveira, Tim Means thing, he and Rogan made a complete hash of that entire situation and confused everybody. Whereas McCarthy should know the ins and outs of the unified rules. And it also comes at a time when the unified rules, quote unquote, aren't that unified. It depends on what state they're going. California, I think, has adopted the new rules, but there are other states that still haven't. Or I think in the case of Michigan, or was it your commission? Was it Winnipeg's commission that adopted some of the new rule set, but not others? I mean, that to me is an incredibly fractured state. So I would assume that Bellator would rely on McCarthy to know these things, and then and explain them as eloquently as he can. It's not a case where he has trouble speaking or anything like that. It's, can he make this interesting? Can he be informative? Can he elevate the quality of Bellator's broadcast production? Because it might not be important to some people, but at least in my view, what makes a sports watching experience so good is the quality of the production. And if it's substandard, it's kind of hard to enjoy the event. I don't want to watch sports events on mute. That's impractical. So I don't want to do that for Bellator either.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one thing you were talking about, I forget what the card was, but it was they passed every new rule except for the grounded opponent rule. I think that's what it was.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it might have been UFC 218. It was either the Dos Anjos Lawler card or UFC 218. I think it was 218.
Yeah, I don't think it was Winnipeg, just because I think I remember hearing it on the broadcast, and obviously I was there for that card, so probably was the Holloway Aldo card. But nonetheless, all that whole situation is weird. But is there anything else we want to say about McCarthy? I think we've covered pretty much the basics. That I give him credit for trying something mostly new. I know he's done a bit of commentary 10 years ago or 11 years ago, but this is going to be sort of a long-term thing, it seems, at least for a few years anyways, multi-fight deal. So I commend him for trying something new. I'm not so sure how well it will work out. I'm surprised Bellator signed a multi-fight deal, if I'm being honest, just because I would have been expecting them to, do a 1-year deal and sort of a trial period. They're sort of going all in on John McCarthy as commentator, and that might not work out, as we said.
Yeah, it's a risk-reward thing for somebody as inexperienced as him, but it's not like we haven't seen in other sports. CBS has got Tony Romo as their lead broadcaster. He hadn't done an NFL game in his life as an analyst, and he's pretty good at it. But it's a lot different when you're a referee. His one experience as a broadcaster was 10 years ago. Hopefully he's gotten better at it. You don't want these things to fail, especially for Bellator. So not much else for me to say about Big John other than best of luck to him as he moves on to this next phase of his career. It is certainly unexpected that he's sort of getting out of the refereeing business.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let us move on to UFC Fight Night 124. It goes down this Sunday night in St. Louis, Missouri. It is, as I said, UFC Fight Night 124. Jeremy Stephens, Duho Choi in the main event. Pivotal featherweight fight number 9, number 13. As I said earlier, we also have Uriah Hall versus former UFC champion Vitor Belfort. Paige Van Zander's returning. Kamaru Usman gets another fight. To the dislike of Michael Johnson, we have Michael Johnson versus Darren Elkins on the feature prelim fight. He is not happy about that, especially, I guess Johnson was born in St. Louis, or I think he mentioned that it was his hometown, but
yeah, he's born and raised there, I believe.
Okay. So yeah, that seems a bit weird, but I don't, do you know why they're going with a 4-fight FS1 card? Like, main card that is, I'm not against it, because that just means it'll start earlier, the whole card, and end earlier, but maybe that's a new change. Maybe that will be more of a permanent thing.
I wish it was a permanent thing, but it isn't. What they've done these last 2 or 3 years is they normally have the NFL playoff broadcast on Fox kind of lead in to a UFC show on FS1. That's what they're hoping for with the big ratings. So that's why they make it a 4-fight main card, so that the main card, quote, starts a little later than planned, and it's also shorter. It'd be on a Sunday night. If they were running a 6-fight main card on a Sunday night that takes you to 1 a.m. Eastern time, it'd be beyond irritating. So I think this is something they do, once or twice a year. I wish they would do it more often, because 6-fight main cards on that channel is just painful.
Yeah, I just realized that the first January fight night that came to mind was the McGregor-Seaver one in 2015, and as I Googled it, of course, it's a 4-fight. So fortunately, this doesn't seem like a permanent thing, just their typical first FS1 card of January sort of thing because of the NFL. But let's dive in. Where do we want to start? Maybe we'll go through the main card and sort of pick our way through the prelims a little bit. Let's start with Kamaru Usman, Emil Mech. Usman's a big favorite, no surprise, but Mech is, I believe, undefeated in the UFC. I want to say he's 2-0. Could be wrong there, but he's definitely an exciting fighter. But Usman is one of the best welterweights on the planet. He doesn't get the respect he deserves simply because he doesn't get the opponent he deserves. And I don't know if that's more of a case of fighters not wanting to fight him or the UFC, for whatever reason, not giving him top talent. At this point, I would probably predict the former, just because how could you not give Kamaru Usman a top 10 guy? But who knows? But nevertheless, he's taken on Norway's Emil Mek. What are your thoughts on this one? Usman versus Emil Mek.
It's an odd fight to make. I feel like Usman should be getting top 10 competition by now. Maybe it could be a case where several of the welterweights are booked right now, but this doesn't feel like a major step up in competition from Sergio Moraes. Now, don't get me wrong, Emil Mek is a good fighter. He'll be forever remembered for knocking out Husamar Palhares in Bellator FC, but he's only fought once in the UFC, and I think that was the win over Jordan Meehan. And I think he had some issue with USADA. It wasn't a drug test failure, but it might have been disclosure, some prescribed medication he was taking. And then he had an injury, so he hasn't fought in a while. I expect Usman to win, and I've been high on Usman for a couple of years now. I was impressed with him on The Ultimate Fighter, and over these last few fights, he's shown a lot more of a meanness to his striking game. And I've spoken to him before. He wants to make sure that he never, as he improves his striking, he doesn't want to go away from what got him here, which is his wrestling. And not only is Usman a very good wrestler, he has got very dangerous top control, and he's strong too. So I expect Usman to win. It's just a matter of what's next after that. It would have to be a real big top 5, top 10 opponent. He shouldn't be too far away from a title shot at this point.
No, and realistically, he shouldn't, but he kind of is. Like, he's number 10. He beats Emil Mek, and there's no saying he'll get a big step up. I mean, he deserves it, but he also deserved one after, say, Sean Strickland, or especially after Sergio Moraes. That was sort of the cap on it all. Big first-round knockout, big statement, where his last few fights had been all decisions. But, like, just looking at his UFC career, he debuted, Ultimate Fighter winner, Hayder Hassan, submission, and then 4 decisions, Leon Edwards, Alexander Yakovlev, Orly Alves, Sean Strickland, and then, of course, the knockout over Sergio Moraes in September. And you would have thought that he called for a top 10 guy, to fight a top 10 guy. It was, he deserved it. It was interesting because Kamaru Usman might be, the third best welterweight on the planet right now. He might beat Tyron Woodley tomorrow, if they fought tomorrow, and yet he's ranked number 10. And it's unfortunate where Nigerian Nightmare is in his career. But nonetheless, I think he gets the job done against Emil Mek. Mek is a good fighter. He beat, so we just want to know, he beat Jordan Meehan in his debut. Pretty good performance. That was a while ago, as you said. So he's coming off a layoff. That's a little concerning. But I think Usman, layoff or not for Mek, I think Usman's the much, much better fighter. As I said, very high on him. I mean, I'm pretty high on Mek as well, but it's a different level. Kamaru Usman's a big favorite for a good reason. He should get the job done here. Maybe a stoppage. I mean, the guy is hungry. The guy wants a top 10 guy, top 5 guy, eventually a title shot sooner than later. So I have no reason to doubt the fact that he'll go out and probably stop Emil Mek. I mean, Mek is tough, but you can't just keep taking strikes. And even if you have a good chin, eventually the ref is going to step in if it gets to that point. So I'm going to Kamaru Usman. I'll go him by probably TKO. Maybe he gets a submission, although he doesn't have too many of those under his belt. So you never know.
Maybe that's the problem, is that he's kind of Khabib-like. I'm not going to compare him directly to Khabib, but he's been getting a lot of decision wins where it looks like he probably could have finished Yakovlev. I remember he had him in a dominant position, full mount multiple times, and he couldn't stop him. And this win over Moraes was his first finish since the Ultimate Fighter finale. Yeah. And the UFC, for better or worse, and mostly worse, they seem to punish guys who don't have great finishing abilities. But I believe that Usman has that potential to be a regular fight finisher from here on out. He's got power in his hands. He's got good ground and pound. So as long as he keeps improving and he shows more of a real mean streak to his game, it's going to be hard to deny him bigger fights.
But as of late as well, his striking has improved so much. I remember seeing the Worley Alves fight, and I think before the Alves fight, so I guess before that he would have had just the It was Yakovlev before that. And that was, I actually don't know if I caught that one, but I think that was a pretty dominant win, sort of takedowns. Like his wrestling has always been fantastic, but his striking hasn't been great until about since the Alves fight was then November 2016 is sort of when I saw the jump in striking. And he had a couple decisions afterwards, but he got the knockout against Moraes, as we said. And so I think that jump is going to be really important as far as his improvements, as far as being well-rounded. Going from wrestler to a well-rounded MMA fighter, I think that's going to help him as far as getting the big opportunities, because he won't be looked at as, say, a Khabib Nurmagomedov figure. He'll be looked at as an exciting fighter, and he has gotten more exciting as well. I think as his striking has evolved, he's become more exciting. I remember really enjoying the Alves fight a year and a bit ago. So I think it's looking good for Usman. And at this point, he's done enough. I mean, he got the knockout. He ended his streak of decisions. So what more can you ask of the guy? If he gets another decision, that's not great. But I'm not going to say he decisions Emil Mech, and he doesn't deserve a top 10 guy. I don't think that should be the case whatsoever. Mech is tough, and there's a chance he doesn't get a stoppage. And I don't think we should really take a point from him in a way as far as what he where he goes from there. But Paige Van Zandt is taking on Jessica Rose Clark in the next fight, second fight on the 4-fight FS1 main card. It's a flyweight fight. And isn't fighting for the flyweight title. That's all I can say. I believe coming off a loss at 115. So she hasn't fought in a while. She was submitted by Michelle the Karate Hottie Watterson in December 2016, has been out of action since. Jessica Rose Clark just made her debut, beat Beck Rawlings, upset, decent performance. What do you got for us on this one? Do you think Van Zandt gets it done, or a little upset here?
Boy, this was a tough fight to call because Rose Clark, she got the win over Beck Rawlings. It was a split decision. It wasn't an overly convincing performance, and Beck Rawlings is just not a good enough athlete to really be a contender in whatever division she competes in, whether it's strawweight or flyweight. Whereas Van Zandt is a very good athlete, but she's not skilled enough yet to be an elite fighter. And the way she lost to Michelle Watterson, like the Namajunas fight, there's no shame in that. She's the current champion. Namajunas had just improved leaps and bounds by then. And Van Zandt, try as she might, she was just overmatched. But Watterson just dominated her from the opening bell up until she got the submission. So this is an important fight for Van Zandt because the UFC continues to push her as the next big thing. I would not be surprised if they gave her a title shot off of this win, which would be, not justifiable, especially since Shevchenko is fighting in a couple of weeks as well. So you would think Shevchenko would be the much more qualified fighter to fight for the flyweight title. But Van Zandt does a lot of flashy things, but she doesn't have a well-rounded technical game. And I think that it's really important for her to show the type of discipline that even she had against Felice Herrick and build upon that. Like if she were to rematch Herrick down at 115 right now, I would not confidently pick Van Zandt to win the fight. And Van Zandt dominated her the first time around.
It feels like she hasn't gotten much better when a lot of people around her have.
Yes, and that's the big thing. Now, she is still very young. She's 23 years old. So it'd be wrong to give up on her, especially when she's, 10 fights into her career, 4 or 5 years into her professional career. She was supposed to fight, I believe, Jessica Ai in August. And no, it wasn't August. It was October, UFC 216. And then she had just a litany of injuries that forced her out of the bout. So maybe some of the time off, the injuries aside, might be a good thing for her. She can focus on getting better and improving the holes in her game, because especially when it's on the ground, she's just not been particularly good when dealing with a superior and more well-rounded fighter. Rose Clark, so I'm going to go with Van Zandt tentatively, but I wouldn't be surprised if Rose Clark was able to get a somewhat ugly decision win.
I just want to quickly add on to what you said about the whole Shevchenko, Van Zandt, Nico Montano, who gets the title shot. My thinking is, I think they give it to Shevchenko, but as you said, I wouldn't be shocked if they give it to Van Zandt. I would not be shocked if Van Zandt wins this fight. Of course, if she wins this fight, it's not a it's not a given, it's not a no brainer. But if she gets past Rose Clark, which I ultimately think she will, I won't be shocked to see Nico Montano fight Paige Van Zandt for his title of defense. That's a winnable fight for Nico Montano. Maybe they're wanting to push her. More likely, it's kind of a winnable fight for Van Zandt, much more than if Van Zandt was fighting Shevchenko. Basically, they want Van Zandt to hold UFC gold. The only way that's happening at 115 or 125, unless she makes drastic improvements in the next few years, is before Shevchenko fights Nico Montano. Shevchenko will beat Nico Montano, no doubt. And if Shevchenko gets a hold of Nico Montano before Van Zandt does, no UFC titles, for Paige Van Zandt. So I think that's my thinking there, where if they're really wanting Van Zandt to hold that gold, maybe they'll give her sort of the undeserved shot. If they're trying to make it as much of a sport as possible, which really hasn't worked in the past few years whatsoever. If they're trying to go back to that a little bit, they'll give it to Shevchenko, but who knows?
Yeah, I can just imagine a situation. And by the way, I'm looking at the betting odds, and Rose Clark is actually favored.
Oh, wow.
So a slight favorite. She's minus 125 on 5 dimes, whereas Van Zandt is plus 105. So that is definitely interesting. I did not expect that. But you can just imagine a scenario where Van Zandt gets a flashy finish, whether it be a knockout similar to the one she had against Beck Rawlings, or an armbar, or swift rear naked choke, something like that. Something that gets the crowd really excited to see Van Zandt possibly get a title shot. She'll ask for it in a post-fight interview or whatever. You see that, and then you see Shevchenko in her next fight against Priscilla. I can't pronounce her name, or I can't remember her name specifically. I do remember her name is Priscilla. I got to look it up. But if she wins that fight in February, and it's kind of a ho-hum decision, and it's not much more exciting than the win against, or sorry, not she didn't beat her. If it's not much more exciting than the Amanda Nunes fight, they would absolutely give the title shot to Van Zandt. So it's all about style points in a way. So if Van Zandt wants a title shot, it would just take a combination to me of her winning very impressively, and for Shevchenko to win, well, if she loses, then that's a problem. But if she wins and doesn't dominate or doesn't particularly wow anybody, the UFC is just going to press that Van Zandt button and just at least get her a title shot. They've been so badly wanting Van Zandt to be at the very top, and she hasn't proven it yet. So this is her opportunity.
I'm interested to see how the new weight class affects her, just because she wasn't a big 115 fighter. So it's going to be interesting to see, is she undersized? I guess Jessica Rose Clark at one point or another was a 115 herself, but and surprisingly, Van Zandt actually has a reach advantage. But so I guess that won't really change much. But more interestingly, I'm excited or intrigued to see her off the layoff. Like, she's young. She took over a year off. She changed her camps. Now she's in Oregon training with Chael Sonnen and whoever else is there. And so I'm interested to see how that, if that has made her better. If the year off at a new camp, gone from Team Alpha Male, which I'm not actually sure if that was a great move. I don't know who she's training with, because she's not, sparring with Chael Sonnen. So I don't even know who her main training partners would be in Oregon. But I would imagine.
I did not even know she had switched to training in Oregon. I mean, that's where she's from, so I guess she doesn't want to travel back and forth. But it's not like Oregon to Sacramento is the other side of the world. Maybe she just wants to be closer to home. But that is an interesting thing. I did not know. So maybe the new camp will be a bit of a benefit for her, because Team Alpha Male, I still think is a very good camp, but there are some flaws in her game that I don't think. Yeah, it's possible that was the case, where not every fighter is going to mesh well at certain camps. Even if they're great fighters, they don't just stay at one place for a while. They find that ideal camp. Sometimes it takes multiple times. So if this is a small camp for Van Zandt, then it's really hard for top fighters to thrive in lesser camps. But if she's training with notable people, it's different than boxing and MMA. It's kind of a case where you got to be with high level fighters at all times if you want to be among the elites. So if she's doing that, then that's encouraging.
Alrighty, co-main event time. Middleweights, Uriah Hall, prime time. Vitor Belfort, the Phenom. What did they call him? The old dinosaur, or something like that. Why is this fight happening? That's sort of my first question.
This fight is either going to end in a spinning kick knockout for one of these two, or it is going to be 15 minutes of completely unwatchable staring.
Yeah, that
And you
seems
know,
like good analysis.
yeah, it feels exactly, and with an ugly split decision that possibly goes against Uriah Hall because he dropped a couple of split decisions that way. So, Uriah Hall, he got the big win over Krzysztof Jotko. I thought for sure he was going to get demolished in that first round, but as soon as Jotko showed signs of fatigue, I'm thinking this is the Mousasi fight all over again. And Mousasi didn't tire when he lost to Hall, but for Jotko it was a lot worse. The steam was gone from his punches, and Hall was still reasonably fresh, and he ended up getting the knockout. It's just that Uriah Hall, first off, he's not a prospect anymore, and people still talk about his potential like he hasn't been in the sport for a really long time. It's just a matter of I'd rather accept that he is who he is. He's not quite a top five contender, but he can still stick around the UFC as an action fighter. You put him in the right matchup, and you can produce a fun fight, which is what that Yako fight definitely was. But we've seen Hall in some less than compelling bouts. Some of it, I think, is that he's just not great enough or well-rounded enough to contend. And then the other part of it is mental, because you've seen some of Hall's behavior in interviews and some of his performances in the cage, where you wonder if his head is really in it. So it's more of a combination of the two, I believe. Vitor is a winnable matchup for him.
It is, and that's one of the things the UFC does sometimes. Like occasionally, we'll see veteran versus veteran, sort of fading guy versus fading guy. But sometimes we also see these matchups where, and I don't really understand this one because Uriah Hall, as you said, he's not a top prospect anymore. He's been around for quite a while, and he hasn't, completely risen to the occasion, and he hasn't become that top five guy a lot of people expected him to be one day. And so I don't understand why they're. It seems to me like they're trying to feed a former champion in Vitor Belfort to Uriah Hall, who's the next big thing, but he's not. And so I don't understand this matchup because more, to me, in my opinion, my prediction is that it ends in a knockout for Uriah Hall. And it kind of pains me to say that because I don't know how confident I can be in Uriah Hall winning a fight, because he's completely all over the place. He's very inconsistent. Sometimes he is one of the better fighters on the planet in the middleweight division. Sometimes he lands those crazy kicks and knocks out guys like Gegard Mousasi, but other times he gets grounded up by Hoffman Otal and loses a staring contest to someone else. And so he's so unreliable. But when you're fighting Vitor Belfort in 2018, how bad do you have to be to lose to him? Like Nate Marquardt arguably beat Vitor Belfort and he's retired. And so I can't have any faith in Vitor Belfort. I have little faith in Uriah Hall in general, but that's just a bit more than what I have in the Brazilian Vitor Belfort. So I got to go Uriah Hall. But I think the biggest thing here is that why is this fight happening? As I said off the top, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Uriah Hall knocking out Vitor Belfort won't do that much for Vitor. Well, it'll hurt Vitor Belfort. Let's be honest, it won't do a ton for Uriah Hall. He has the name on his record, but we've seen in the past where a huge, a knockout over a fading veteran doesn't actually mean too much because hardcore fans know better. And for the UFC, I don't see Uriah Hall going on a tear. So it's a confusing fight. It's a fight, and also Vitor Belfort should be retired.
I think he might be retiring after this fight. It's kind of confusing why this fight isn't just in Brazil, especially since there's a Brazil show 3 weeks after this. Vitor, post TRT Vitor, we can conclusively say is not the same fighter.
No,
not even close. And one thing Uriah Hall definitely is, at least in my view, is faster than Vitor Belfort. I mean, when Vitor is struggling to pull the trigger on Nate Marquardt, who is retired and tends to struggle against guys like Vitor historically, then that's when he's just past it. And Gastelum wiped him out. All of his losses have just been total blowouts. So it is. I wouldn't be surprised if Uriah Hall inexplicably lost this because it is Uriah Hall. But what I'm expecting is Hall to land something spectacular and get a knockout. But the fight itself is probably not going to be entertaining. Vitor
Yeah.
doesn't do those flurries anymore with any great effectiveness, and Hall is just a low volume striker. So this could be fun. It could be one that has people leaving before the very exciting main event.
It could just be sort of Vitor Belfort versus Nate Marquardt from last year all over again, sort of in a way.
Oh man, I don't need that vision in my head.
No. But although you say Vitor Belfort might be retiring after this, although we have to put an asterisk beside that because that probably means just going over to Ryzen.
Yes, probably. And then all of a sudden, TRT Vitor can return.
And that's something I would be excited about. Like, dead serious. If Vitor Belfort is juiced up in Ryzen in Japan, I will be watching. I will stay up till 3 a.m. or whenever he fights. That is something I'm interested in. No TRT Vitor Belfort in 2018 in the UFC in the United States. No, thank you. So goes to Ryzen. I'm down, honestly. But if he's not on TRT, if he's in the UFC in North America, he should retire. But yeah, if he goes to Ryzen, that'd be fantastic, I think.
Yeah, until they do like Vitor Belfort versus Bigfoot Silva, and then everybody is sad when Bigfoot gets knocked out by a middleweight.
Oh, geez, that would be. Oh, I can't even fathom how bad that would be just in general. Like, yeah, both guys need to retire. Maybe skip the whole Ryzen thing.
Yeah, maybe.
All right, main event time. We got Jeremy Stephens, Doo-Ho Choi in the featherweight division. Pretty, not even pretty, very fun fight at 145 pounds. Little Heathen, Korean Superboy. Stephens is coming off that pretty entertaining and pretty convincing win over Gilbert Melendez, or should I say Giblet Melendez. And also, Doo-Ho Choi has not fought in a year. He's coming off that fight of the year for 2016, loss to Cub Swanson, very close fight. Extremely fun fight. If you haven't seen it for whatever reason, go back and watch it. And interestingly, something that has come out of just leading up to this fight, Doo-Ho Choi, at the end of, I want to say this year, maybe he has 2 more years, but he has to go away to do his, he has to serve in the military. Mandatory,
yeah.
Exactly. And so that, I believe, will last for 2 years. So do you remember, does that start at the beginning of next year?
I think it's the start of next year.
Okay.
And
so we have a year of Doo-Ho
yeah.
Choi in the next 3 years. That is not something I'm a fan of. It's unfortunate. It's sort of, the Korean Zombie all over again. And it was unfortunate. Korean Zombie was gone for quite a while. And so that'll be the sort of the same situation. And it's more so unfortunate because Doo-Ho Choi, despite already having 16 fights in MMA, he's still very early in his career. He's only had a handful of fights in the UFC. He's still sort of on the come up, and he could go places, but that 2-year gap will definitely hurt him. What are your thoughts on this fight? I mean, Choi could win, Stephens could win. It really could go either way.
I love this fight. People were kind of down on this being the main event. I don't have an issue with this because I think there is actually a possibility this goes past round 3. It should be an entertaining fight. It may not be an ideal main event for the UFC's typical major January show because they've historically done over the last 3 years what? McGregor versus Seaver, Dillashaw Cruz. Then we get to Yair Rodriguez, BJ Penn. So now we're down to Stephens versus Doo-Ho Choi. I can see the disappointment from that perspective, but from a fan of just real crazy fun fights, this is ideal for me. I'm leaning towards Doo-Ho Choi to get the win here. Now, Stephens has only been knocked out once, and that was against Eve Edwards, and this was back in 2012. This is when Stephens was having his real tough run of defeats at lightweight. But for as much as people tout Jeremy Stephens' power, he definitely hits hard, but he is not a prolific finisher. And that is a key distinction to make. It's in the same way that Jimmy Rivera is. He dropped Thomas Almeida twice. He's gotten some knockdowns in the UFC, but decision and he's not a prolific finisher. So Stephens only has 3 knockouts in his last 18 fights. So I'm obviously including his losses as well. Still, that's 3 knockouts for the whole of this decade, from 2010 to present day. He's got 3 finishes. And what are they? Marcus Davis, Hani Jason, and Dennis Bermudez. Hopefully Choi has shored up some of his defensive flaws because he engaged. I picked Cub Swanson to win that fight, and I was on pins and needles when Cub was hurt. But there's only so much punishment you can take before you kind of get a little bit concerned that he might be Korean Zombie 2.0, where it's going to take knockout for him to change his defensive style. But offensively, he is a powerhouse. He's got serious power in both hands. I love watching him compete, and I think he has what it takes to actually put away Stevens. It won't be a one-shot, 10-second knockout or first couple of minutes. I think it's going to be a little more tactical to start, and then when the fight gets steadily crazier, Choi's power is going to be the difference here.
I'm leaning the same way. I like Doo Ho Choi here, but I don't like him a lot. I mean, Jeremy Stevens, although he's getting up there, he has, he's a veteran at this point. He has a ton of experience, but he seems to be getting better. I think his win over Melendez was very impressive. That could be because Melendez is on the way down more than Stevens is on the way up. And I can't really say Stevens is on the way up because he's always been fringe top 10, top 15 featherweight for quite some time, past few years at the very least. So he hasn't changed. And that's in a way a good thing. Like we know we're not expecting a huge decline, say tomorrow, but he's not going to be maybe a future champion. Doo Ho Choi on the other case, or on the other side, might just be a future champion. That's what people were saying before the Cub Swanson fight. Talks would have died down, but the fact that it was a fight of the year for 2016 still definitely helped. And ultimately, that definitely increased his stock, Choi's stock. In defeat, he definitely got a bit more popular after that one. Just obviously is super exciting. And I think we might see, I can't say we're going to see a completely similar fight. Like I can't say this is going to be 2018's fight of the year or anything, but I think it can be very exciting. Stevens is probably going to look to chop, Choi down with leg kicks, I would imagine. And in Stevens' case, he's kind of an odd fighter because we think of Jeremy Stevens, as you talked about, as some huge knockout, one-punch KO guy, but he's not really that. Doo Ho Choi, on the other hand, does have power, and sometimes it can be deceiving because he looks like a little kid, yet then he goes out there and murks guys. And so it's a very interesting matchup how they will go up against each other, simply because Stevens is more of a brawler, while Choi, although very exciting, is a bit more tactical. He's a bit more technical, go behind his jab a little bit and then land the power shots later on. I'm leaning Choi by decision just because Stevens is a very tough fighter. And as you said, he's only been knocked out one time in his career. And so I don't think that number changes. I think Choi gets the job done. I think it's one more loss under Stevens on his record, but I'm not sure it's going to be a second knockout loss. I'm thinking Doo Ho Choi gets the job done by decision. Stevens is going to make it competitive. There's no doubt about it. Stevens is going to win probably 2 rounds, but I think Choi just might be able to outpoint him a little bit because he's the more technical guy. But if Stevens gets up in his face, I mean, we've seen that's definitely a place to pause, I think. But Doo Ho Choi was under a lot of pressure against Cub Swanson, and he was getting beat up in that fight at certain points, but he kind of like the Korean Zombie, as you said, the guy has a heck of a chin, and he's not a guy to just fade away completely. He seems to slow down a little bit, but he definitely doesn't just all of a sudden give up. He's going to be hanging in there no matter what Stevens throws, and I think that helps him as well. So I like Doo Ho Choi, and I like him by decision. If we see a stoppage, simply because Stevens can hit hard at times and Choi certainly can, wouldn't shock me, but both guys have pretty good chins historically, so I think it will go all 25 minutes, and I'm looking forward to it because I think over 5 rounds, this can be one of the better fights maybe of all year. I'm wondering, I know the 2-year gap because of his military service coming up in a year will definitely hinder his potential, but in your opinion, where do you sort of see Doo Ho Choi in the future? Is this a guy? Are you going to go out there, and say he's a future champion? Are you that high on Choi or not quite?
It's really tough. I'm not sure that he might be championship material like Brian Ortega to be the Swanson win. when he beat Renato Moicano the way he did, I'm thinking that guy looks like he's got championship. Whereas at worst for Duho Choi, he's an action fighter, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, at best, he's a very talented athlete. As I said about his striking, it's lethal. He's very precise with his shots. His precision is precise, to quote Mike Goldberg. And for the key to me for him to beat Stevens is he's kind of got to frustrate him, because Stevens, he's not terribly difficult to get off of his game, and that's what happened when Moicano just kind of outpointed him because he's got better footwork and pretty good technical striking. Same thing happened with Cub Swanson. It took him a couple of rounds, but once he got his timing down on Jeremy Stevens, Swanson ended up winning that fight. Same thing with Max Holloway. So just to prove that he belongs up there in the upper echelon of featherweights, beating Jeremy Stevens is kind of the litmus test at featherweights, because Stevens tends to only lose to really the top level guys. So I think that Choi, we haven't seen enough of him, overall in the UFC. A couple of his fights have been really quick, and then the Swanson fight, of course, was an absolute war. It was such a war that the UFC's free fight for him is the Swanson fights. I mean, how often do you see a guy's headlining spot get promoted on a fight he lost? That tells you something. Yes,
Yeah.
we got to see more from Choi, or as much as we can before he enrolls in military service. Like how is he on the ground? How is he in grappling exchanges? Stevens is probably not the guy to test that, but I don't see championship material just yet, but I do see him as at least a long-term contender, which is saying something. Because featherweight's a phenomenal division.
And as you said off the top before, breaking the fight down, you don't have a problem with it being the main event, nor do I. I saw, like you, a lot of people sort of hating on it as the main event, saying it's a great fight, not main event material even for FS1, but I disagree. I'd rather these sort of prospect veteran matches, in a way, like this is completely different than Hall, Vitor Belfort, even a legitimate, like, I think when at one point Shogun was supposed to fight Serkinov or something like that. Now that was a typical veteran versus prospect, but in here we have a guy who was time and a sort of a guy still on the come up, and so it will be interesting to see how this affects Choi's stock, particularly going forward. Does the main event, or being in the main event, being on FS1, the headliner, does that affect him? Does that draw more eyes? Perhaps. But I don't have a problem with it. Like, this is a great fight. And if you are ranked and very exciting, sure, be in an FS1 main event. I totally am okay with it. And I was surprised how many people weren't. Let us move on real quick to Gets It Doesn't Get It. I know we only have a few minutes left, so let's go through these rather quickly. Our first one for Gets It Doesn't Get It, and I don't know, I guess I should quickly explain how this works. So I know at one point we just did, I would give one for both Gets It Doesn't Get It, and then my co-host, typically Andrew Lawrence, would give his for the week. But now we sort of changed it. We're picking just a handful of people or things or promotions or anything. And we're sort of debating a little bit as far as do they get it or not get it. So similar, but a little different. So our first one is a Chris Cyborg for not being interested in the Amanda Nunes fight. Of course, Dana White and Nunes both want Cyborg versus Nunes to happen. So, super fight, women's featherweight champion, women's bantamweight champion would be a fun fight. But do you say Cyborg is in the right for not wanting? Is it fair for her not to want it, or does she not get it here?
She doesn't get it. Well, I can understand her not wanting to fight another Brazilian, but beyond that, there are so few fights for her that can sell on a pay-per-view. Like, any other fight that she does either can't headline a pay-per-view or should be put on FS1 or Fox. And maybe Megan Anderson would be a possible pay-per-view main event, but that would not, depending on how 219 did on pay-per-view. I doubt Anderson versus Cyborg does well on pay-per-view either. It's an ideal fight for both Nunes and Cyborg, because Nunes doesn't have that many available title challengers at 135, because Shevchenko just is going down to flyweight. And then the one woman who we thought would be the next title challenger for her, Raquel Pennington, she's recovering from a broken leg. Now, from Cyborg's point of view, if it's about getting the bigger money fights, the Rousey idea has it's clearly sailed. I don't really see much interest in a home rematch. She conclusively won that fight, no matter what the silly scorecards say. fighting Amanda Nunes is the type of fight that could not only headline a pay-per-view, it could possibly headline a pay-per-view in Brazil. So if Cyborg doesn't want to fight Nunes and is instead wanting to face the Shark Tank that is the women's featherweight division, then she is not really going to be drawing too much, in terms of pay-per-view buys or general interest. I think people want to see her at this stage in fights where she might lose, not necessarily in fights where she's going to be like a minus 2,000 favorite.
I think your points are completely valid, and probably more so than what my argument is about to be. But I'm going to go on the other other side and say she actually gets it here. I feel like pretty much all of her UFC career has basically been the UFC saying something and Chris Cyborg in a way standing up for herself, like saying, "Oh, that's not true," or this and that, and it's sort of entertaining. Like I love when fighters will sort of go against the UFC just because not enough fighters do and stand up for themselves. So I like that part of it. But as far as what's actually smart for her, taking the Nunes fight probably is smart. Although that's a winnable fight for Nunes. I saw some people after the home fight with Cyborg say I'd pick Nunes. And so in that regard, it might not actually be a smart choice. Like it'll get her the most money, most likely. Because that's the biggest fight for either fighter right now. But it's also, she's fighting a bantamweight. She has no reason to. She shouldn't feel obliged to take that fight. So if she doesn't want it, I think it's great that she's sort of, as I said, going out there and not being afraid and saying, yeah, I have no interest. I think the one part where she doesn't get it all is she called out or she mentioned some fighters who I'd never heard of. And I don't know their names off the top of my head, maybe some Invicta fighters, or I think Cindy Dandois was thrown in there. And that's a big doesn't get it. Chris Cyborg should not be talking about any fighters really other than Nunes or Megan Anderson. But I think if she sort of campaigns for the Megan Anderson fight, it's also keeping the featherweight division kind of in order or getting it to order, because it's not in order right now. We don't even have rankings for it. We have one fighter, that's it. But I think if she starts to campaign for let's actually build this featherweight division, starting with the title defense against Megan Anderson, that might actually help her in the long run a bit more than just keeping on bringing in bantamweights. And so I think she gets it, but I can definitely see why she wouldn't get it, simply because Nunes is the biggest fight she has right now. Next one, Michael Johnson, for, as I mentioned a bit earlier, he complaining about being on the prelim card for this card for UFC St. Louis. Darren Elkins, he's fighting Darren Elkins in the last FS1 prelim. Does Michael Johnson get it or not get it for going out there, being vocal and saying, hey, I should be on the main card?
It's kind of both. He gets it in that I think he actually should be on the main card because people should remember him from the Justin Gaethje fight. That was a crazy fight. And also, he is, 2 or 3 fights removed from headlining a UFC Fight Night against Dustin Poirier and knocking him out. So I know he's, 1-4 in his last 5, but Dustin Poirier has a very good win on his record. And he was very close to beating Justin Gaethje. He is a St. Louis native. Now, he's going to be headlining the prelims. And I guess the downside of that is that the main card gets much better ratings than the prelims. And from a crowd perspective, who knows how St. Louis is going to react? Is St. Louis, are the St. Louis fans going to be all there from the first fight to the final fight, and then it won't matter as much, or prelims and then slowly but surely fill up as the main card progresses? Because card placement doesn't matter as much in terms of sponsorship money now with this Reebok deal. But when it comes to having the maximum number of fans seeing your fight, especially in Michael Johnson's case, his hometown, I would be understandably upset over not getting onto the main card. He does not have to disparage the other fighters who made the main card. He talked about Vitor Belfort as a senior citizen in the co-main and that he doesn't know who half of the main event is. And obviously that means Jeremy Stephens. What were the other fights? Van Zandt versus Clark. I guess that's probably the only fight that wins, but the UFC is high on Van Zandt and Johnson is coming off a loss. So I guess that's the difference here. If it was a 6-fight main card, he probably would be on the main card. But because this is so maybe it's a little bit of just unfortunate, the unfortunate timing that this is one of those 4-fight main card shows. So he's right. He has a right to voice his disappointment that he's on the prelims. But when you're being on the main card, then it ends up not being a good look for you.
Yeah. I'm going to say Michael Johnson gets it here. And sort of the same idea with the Chris Alborg thing. I like when fighters voice their disappointment with the UFC because not enough fighters do it. And there's a lot of reasons fighters could be disappointed with the UFC, whether it be fighter pay or treatment or anything. And so a fighter complaining, in this case, I mean, if they're complaining about just absolute BS and they have no right to it, then that's fair. But in this case, Michael Johnson has a very good case. Even if he maybe shouldn't be on the main card, he feels that, it's not a stretch whatsoever. He really should be on the main card. Elkins versus Johnson, actually a fairly interesting matchup. And I mean, I'm looking forward to that one much more than Van Zandt Clark. And rankings-wise, they could technically go over Usman Mech. And, of course, Hall Belfort shouldn't be even happening. So I think that fight should be on the main card, firstly, in my opinion. And so I think he has a very good point, and I think Michael Johnson gets it. Last one, the Spider Anderson Silva says he won't stop fighting. He's gonna keep on trekking and keep on going until I think it was God, and we'll say he won't compete or doesn't want him to compete again, something like that. Does Anderson Silva get it or not get it?
Well, he's obviously not getting it as far as addressing this USADA drug test failure because all of his statements, or pretty much all of them, that aside. If he wants to continue his career, he's going to have to get booked real carefully because I'm kind of glad he failed that drug test. I want to see him get completely murked by Calvin Gastelum. I was just guaranteed a non-competitive fight. But even then, how would the UFC book him? Are they going to do Anderson Silva against Eric Anders or an unranked opponent for a couple of years if this drug test failure is serious? So if he does get suspended, does he want out of his contract? I don't think the UFC would be willing to do that because Bellator would probably sign him in an instant. So if I would rather Anderson Silva not continue fighting, but he did come off a win against Derek Brunson, however that might be. So as an adult, it's really not up to me. He's not been on a BJ Penn-esque type losing streak. It's just all these statements without addressing the drug test failure and kind of pretending it's not happening to me is just, especially when you know what the consequences are for what is a second failure in the matter of a couple of years, and this one is his first under USADA.
Yeah. I mean, I gotta agree. Anderson Silva to me doesn't get it. Not addressing the USADA stuff doesn't help for sure, but just the idea that he thinks he can keep on fighting. And I mean, some people, as sort of you talked about a little bit, some people feel like we shouldn't say a fighter should not fight. In some cases, that's definitely right. Like if they're sort of still not completely late in their career, not completely done, we shouldn't go saying, oh, you need to retire. But, say, and Anderson Silva's, I guess, in that case, so maybe he doesn't get it a ton, but let's be honest, Anderson Silva should retire. I mean, I don't need to say, I should be able to say, he can retire, or he shouldn't, blah, blah, blah. But Anderson Silva, we know he should not compete, continue fighting. It doesn't make sense. I mean, yeah, he's getting the bills paid, he's getting money, but he is so far from what he once was. He's on the decline, he's going down, he's losing or should be losing to not lower level guys. Derek Brunson is a very good fighter, but I mean, Anderson Silva losing Derek Brunson is kind of sad just because of where Silva once was. Keeping on testing positive doesn't help. So I'm going to say Anderson Silva doesn't get it. I don't think he should continue fighting. I think he should have retired quite a while ago. And so to think that he's still going on in 2018 shouldn't be happening, in my opinion. So he does not get it. And with that, let us move on to our dumb questions. We have a handful. The first one comes from Tim Burke, our colleague over at bloodyelbow.com. He says, which one of you got better grades in science class this year?
I haven't been in school for years, Tim. And neither of you, well, Tim hasn't been in school in centuries. So maybe he's just, it's a different case there. So Newton wasn't born when Tim was in school. It's genuinely speaking, I greatest person when it comes to science. I passed the tests and all that, the state tests, but those are usually my worst scores. I guess biology would have been my best part of science, but I'm much better at mathematics and geography than I ever was in science.
And English, I would imagine.
English was, I was fine with English, but it was just kind of, it's boring. The boring subject.
Yes, I guess writing about MMA is sort of a little different than Shakespeare and things like that. Yeah, so I guess if we're being completely realistic about this, you haven't been in school, although we like to say you have been, and I wouldn't mind going on with that. But you said it yourself, you haven't been in school. I have taken science courses this year, so I mean, say an 80, even if I got a 60, which I didn't, but even if I did, that beats a 0. Or I don't know what they would give you. Like, it can't be a 0, but it's like not defined or something like that. So a terrible mark would be that. So
when I took science, the passing was kind of like in the 60s, and then the only way you fail is if you get a literal F.
Yeah, we don't even use the A to F scale here in Canada. It's just a flat number. I actually prefer that because it's always confusing to me. It's like an A could be like 100, it could be 95, and I don't know. I don't get that, but whatever. And next question comes from Jed Mashu. We've mentioned him a number of times on the show already. Follow him on Twitter at Jed K Mashu. He says, "How much worse is the show?" Or he didn't. He's a writer and he's tweeting with terrible grammar. He says, word for word, "How much worse is the show be with Mookie instead of me?"
It is a substantial improvement from any time Jed is on anybody's show, and I've been on Jed's show too, and I made it instantly better when it was just me and Naked Gambler talking, and Jed just staying in the background, not saying anything, and then interjecting his usual terrible opinions. But I made sure to suppress that as much as possible.
Jed often gets the thumbs downs. He did good last episode on Saturday, last Saturday, but we got a good amount of thumbs ups and not too many thumbs downs. But although funny story, I was totally out of it as far as talking over my tongue and whatnot. I told everybody to thumbs down, so I wonder if because I messed that up, they actually gave us a thumbs up, thinking it would be a thumbs down. But nonetheless, Jed usually doesn't do good in the ratings department for the MMA Circus, so I predict Mookie Alexander, you'll boost the ratings up a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so. Whenever people see Jed Mashu's name on YouTube, they just X out, go to the next tab.
Yes. Tim Thompson, Fight Talk Tim on Twitter. He says, "Who would win in a fight between 100 Demetrius Johnson says?" I guess that's how you say it. And 10 Brock Lesnar's.
100 Demetrius Johnsons. Well, this would be one hell of a battle in the matchup of mythical MMA figures, but I would have to say 100 Demetrius Johnsons, because that would be enough. If I'm just looking at surface area of Brock Lesnar's, of 10 Brock Lesnar's, I think that would be enough to just completely swarm the 10 Brock Lesnar's. Now, the tough thing is, can you do a video game like Armbar on even one Brock Lesnar?
Yeah, that's interesting. On 10, that'd be impossible almost, but on one, I think a handful of DJs could get it done.
Yeah, it would probably take like 15 alone to fit on one arm, let alone on 10 Brock Lesnar arms. So
right. But I would imagine
I still favor 100 Demetrius Johnsons.
I mean, I would imagine at least 5 of the Lesnars would fail a drug test before the fight. So it's probably realistically going to be 100 DJs, and who he says is only taking Tylenol and whatnot. But 100 DJs versus probably about 4 or 5 Brock. So just a bigger disadvantage for the beast. But when I actually first read this question earlier, when the guy first sent it, I actually read 100 for both, and I was wondering, okay, 100 DJs versus 100 Lesnars, that doesn't make too much sense. But 110, that makes more sense. Last question, I believe, and let me find it. It's from Jed Mashu. You know where to follow him. If you are following him, unfollow him. If you aren't, don't follow him. He says, "What are Mookie's picks for end-of-year champs?" So let's go through this real quick. Just go by the division super quick. Sort of putting you on the spot, but maybe you have an answer.
Okay. Heavyweight, I got to go with Shamil Abdurakhimov. Light heavyweight, I got to go Jean Vellante. Middleweight, that's a tough call.
Vitor
I
Belfort,
will
probably.
say, yeah, probably Vitor Belfort. 170 pounds, CM Punk. We go down to lightweight. It'll be Conor McGregor because they're never ever going to strip him of the title. Featherweight, that's a tough call. Featherweight, I got to go with Paulie Malignaggi because Malignaggi recently fought at welterweight. So, Mayweather's going to stay retired, but Malignaggi's going to sign with the UFC and absolutely starch Max Holloway in his UFC debut. Bantamweight, for a genuine answer, bantamweight, I think Garbrandt is going to get that belt back. Provided that Jean-Claude Van Damme doesn't knock him out with one of those kicks. And then at flyweight, of course, it stays Demetrius Johnson. And then women's featherweight, got to stay with Cyborg. Women's bantamweight, who do you have at women's bantamweight? I guess it's just going to be Nunes by default. Women's flyweight, going to be Valentina Shevchenko. I'm giving real answers now. And then women's strawweight, that's a tough one. I don't know if Nami Yunus is going to stay champion or if Joanna is going to get that belt back or if Jessica Andrade is going to do something. So my bold prediction will be Tisha Torres is going to be the women's strawweight champion at the end of 2018.
How do you think that one happens? Because that's almost more surprising than seeing Punk winning welterweight.
I think Torres is going to beat Andrade, and then Torres fought Nami Yunus to a very close fight when they rematched a couple of years back. I think Torres has steadily gotten better and can be a tough matchup for Nami Yunus. So that's the fight I actually want to see over Nami Yunus and Andrade. Of course, I do want to see a rematch between Joanna and Nami Yunus, but I would not count out Tisha Torres as holding UFC gold.
Alrighty. Well, that is it. Episode 145 of the MMA Circus is in the books. Mookie, can't thank you enough for stepping up on short notice. Really do appreciate it. If anybody is listening who doesn't follow you on Twitter, doesn't know where you're found, let them know. I would imagine mostly everybody does, but in the off chance that someone doesn't, let them know.
All right. You can find me on Twitter at Mookie Alexander. I'm also on Three Amigos podcast with Steffi Haynes and Ian Kidd. We record every Thursday, so the show normally goes up on Friday. Sometimes we record on Wednesday, but the show always goes up on Friday. You can also find my writing on BloodyElbow.com. I do pay-per-view posts for DraftKings once a month or sometimes twice a month if there are 2 UFC pay-per-views that month. And I also write about the Seattle Seahawks on fieldgoals.com. We didn't make the playoffs this year, so that definitely clears up my January schedule. I don't have as much to write on Sunday, so I guess they were being kind by missing the playoffs.
Alrighty, you guys can find me on the Twitter at Nick Baldwin MMA. You can find all of my writing, of course, over at BloodyElbow.com, just where Mookie's is and Tim Burke's and everybody else. You can check out my other shows here on this YouTube channel exclusively Before the Battle and Beyond Combat. Before the Battle will be live tomorrow night. Jed Meshew and Wesley Riddle will be breaking down UFC St. Louis a bit more in depth. The main card, plus, of course, all the prelim fights we did not talk about. And Beyond Combat, one of the newer show I have, it has been off a little bit. It's supposed to be every other week, but past couple times it's been every 3 weeks. This week, we will be talking to Fly Brian Jeffries of MMA Mania and talking about his love and his passion of craft beer. And so that's going to be interesting. An underage kid talking to someone about craft beer. How can you complain about that? That is pretty much everything. Really do appreciate you guys listening. Go subscribe to this YouTube channel. Like us. Thumbs up. I think it's down there. Could be there, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it's there. Comment, rate us, review us, subscribe. Appreciate it. iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, Google Play, SoundCloud, Player FM, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, Player FM, I think I already said, Overcast, Podcast Addict, and I think that's about it. That's where you can find us all on those, all of those podcasting platforms. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate it. As always, for Mookie Alexander, my name's Nick Baldwin, and we're out.